So welcome everybody to the CD17 Environmental Forum. My name is Courtney Williams. I am the co-founder of SAPE Rights Group and founder of Westchester Alliance for Sustainable Solutions. And I'm going to be the moderator tonight. I want to start by thanking all of our co-sponsors. And it's a long list, but I'm going to read it through because these are groups doing very important work and I want to give them the shout out. CCoHope, Indivisible, CD17 Indivisible, Food and Water Action, Grassroots Environmental Education, Green Yorktown, Healing and Protecting Our Land Together, A Call to Prayer, Indian Point Safe Energy Coalition, Indivisible Westchester, Indivisible Yorktown, 350 New Jersey Rockland, Progressive Women of Westchester, religious organizations along the river, also known as ROAR, Rockland Working Families Party, Rockland Coalition to End the New Jim Crow, SAFE Rights Group, Sierra Club Lower Hudson Group, Stony Point Action Committee on Environment, Stop the Algonquin Pipeline Expansion, Westchester Alliance for Sustainable Solutions, Westchester for Change, United for Clean Energy, and Westchester Peace Action Committee Foundation, known as WESPAC. So thank you to all of those organizations for co-sponsoring, for inviting your membership, and for submitting your questions. The questions for tonight come from the organizations that co-sponsored. So on behalf of my co-organizers, Tina Bongar, Marie and Sarah and Susanna Glidden, we are disappointed to inform you that Congressman Sean Patrick Maloney will not be joining us tonight. Despite our best efforts over the past 2 months, the Congressman's campaign would not commit to a date. And given that early voting starts tomorrow, we waited until the last possible minute to schedule this date with his campaign. The Congressman is back in Washington, D.C. to participate in passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. We had hoped that he might send a surrogate or to represent him or to provide written responses to our questions, but the Congressman chose not to do that. He did send at 4:30 this afternoon a 1-minute video provided by his campaign. And so I will play that in lieu of the Congressman's opening statement, but unfortunately that's going to be the extent of his participation. You know, we certainly have a lot of very critical issues facing this district and have been very engaged with our federal electeds in this district. So we had really hoped to have be able to pin him down on his positions on these things. We do have contact info for the campaign. So if you would like to write to him and get answers to the questions that he's not here to provide, we can certainly provide that for you. So with that, I'm going to give Alessandra Biaggi, who is here with us tonight, first go at an introduction. Senator Biaggi, by way of introduction, please share with us what accomplishment from your record shows your commitment to environmental action and climate action. What is the most pressing environmental issue that needs to be addressed, and how would you tackle it?
Well, first of all, let me just say thank you so much to you and to all of the organizations that have taken the time to organize this forum to talk about what I think is one of the most important issues of our lifetimes, and also one of the things that I think is one of the most urgent issues that we will have to address every single day until we are really able to feel as if we've taken enough action, although I frankly think that it will never happen because there is simply so much to do and so much to reverse. However, I know that because we are committed to it, that it's possible. And so I just wanted to start with some gratitude and also a short comment about that. For those of you that don't know me and for those of you that do, I am Alessandra Biaggi. I am a New York State Senator. I am running for Congress in this district, New York 17. I am also an attorney. I've lived in Westchester most of my life, and I am the proud product of the Pelham Public School System. And just to be really brief, I ran for the state Senate in 2018. Most of you, I think, already know that, but part of why I ran in 2018 is very similar to why I'm running today, because I, at that time, was incredibly frustrated with what I deemed to be corrupt corporate-backed politicians who took millions of dollars in corporate donations and as a result blocked crucial legislation that their donors didn't want them to pass. And so being able to run in 2018, despite being an underdog, which I have been many times in many fights that I have taken on, we were outspent 10-1 in 2018, $3 million to our $400,000. I refused to take corporate donations then. I refuse to take corporate donations now. And at that time, we won by almost 10 points. And part of the reason for that is because we built a very large coalition of people from many different backgrounds and many different experiences. And included in that coalition were a lot of climate justice activists and environmentalists and experts that have continued to be part of how I have been able to make progress in Albany. And so after a lot of decades of inaction, when we got to Albany in 2019, we were able to restore power to the Democrats for the first time, truly restore power for the first time in almost 100 years. And part of what we did, which I know that we all know, but it's really important to bear repeating over and over again, because for so many people who are cynical about politics, I think this proves that when you put the right people inside of institutions that feel like they are immovable or they are not changeable, that the way that we do that is by changing the people inside. And one of the most important things that we've done since I've been in Albany is to pass something called the CLCPA. I know that probably everyone here knows what that is, but the Climate Leadership Community Protection Act is the strongest piece of climate justice legislation in the entire country on the state level. Before I even decided that I wanted to run for the state Senate, though, I want you all to know that what informs a lot of how I have made decisions about climate and about what actions we should take, it's rooted in some of my experience as a lawyer working in the governor's office of storm recovery, which was an office that was created after Hurricane Sandy was created. And it was created to help to rebuild New York in ways that included housing, small businesses, infrastructure, community reconstruction. And I was able to oversee those programs through the federal legislation of Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Law. It's an area of the law that I think will become more and more applicable as more storms continue to surge up and down the coast and up and down the, not up and down, across the country in different ways. But what it has done for me is to be able to understand perhaps some of the nuances in the law of things that I would change. So I'll get to that in a moment. But when it comes to the issues that I'm the most proud of, the CLCPA is at the top of that list. Then there's a whole host of other bills that I am so proud to have been part of passing and signing into law with my colleagues in the Senate. Some of those bills include the petroleum tanks bill, which I carried this year. And I specifically carried it because it acutely affected the state Senate district I represent. And the purpose of the bill is to change the color of the paint from dark colors to light colors. And the reason why that matters is because when the sun hits those petroleum tanks, which are usually located in environmental justice communities, the darker color paint means that more toxins will emit at faster rates. And so when you have the lighter paint, it means that they won't. And so that's one thing. This past year, we were able to pass a bill that added 7 different air toxins to the list of toxins that are regulated by New York State. Toxins that are not yet regulated at the federal level, and toxins that are known to cause cancer in human beings, but in many different beings. In addition to that, I am very proud to have been part of supporting things like renewable energy credits and prohibiting certain pesticides, which are harmful to human health. For those of you who don't know, I have a father that has Parkinson's disease. It's quite hard to determine what the cause of that was, but I can tell you right now that I am committed on a lifelong journey of making sure that every single toxin that we know is harmful to humans is prohibited in all of the things that we consume or eat, or even in children's toys, which is another thing that we've done at the state level. I can go on down the list. What I'm going to do instead, though, is I'm going to copy and paste an entire list of a document that I created just to show you the bills that we were able to pass. I think that what it really signifies, again, which I can't repeat enough, is the difference between when you put the people in office who want to be climate justice champions and who want to actually act with urgency around these things, we will see progress in so many of the issues that we're concerned with, but most importantly, climate. And so in this race, I don't think that there is a better way to say this, but there isn't someone in this race other than myself who is more committed to championing the issues that surround climate change, that are urgent around climate change. And more importantly, I think that's rooted in for me, prohibition in my campaign of taking any corporate PAC money from the fossil fuel industry, as well as other special interests. And so I find that to be one of the great harms when it comes to dealing with our urgency around and the progress that we can make around climate justice and climate change. And so that's one of the reasons I don't do it, because my responsibility is to the people that I represent. It's how I've led in the state Senate. It's also how I would lead in Congress. The last thing I'll say, without going on much further, is that in this past legislative session, the Cryptocurrency Moratorium Act was something that I found to be quite important. And even though the governor has not yet signed it, I think that the reason why I highlight that is because there are many industries that we still do not regulate. Crypto is one of them. The fashion industry is another one. It's an industry that has contributed roughly between 8 and 9% of global greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. And that's important for us to be able to take a crack at, because it's something that contributes to the increasing not just demand on energy, but the waste of energy, things like water, things like electricity, but also it's polluting our air and polluting our water and polluting our environments. And so one of the things I just want you to know, and one of the things that I feel very committed to, is that when we're dealing with any of the regulations that are before us or the industries that need to be regulated, that being creative about how we are solving these problems, and also thinking outside of the box of what industries actually need to be regulated still, what have we left off of the table, and how can we collectively as a community do these things together? Because at the end of the day, there is not a single bill that I have passed in Albany without the help of the community I represent, or activists or organizers or others who care about this issue or other issues that are directly impacted. And to me, that's the source of power that I most draw from.
Thank you, Senator Biaggi. So everyone, I'm going to try and share my screen so that we can show the video that was sent to us, and hopefully the sound will come through for everybody.
Hi, it's Sean Patrick Maloney. I'm so sorry to be missing the forum tonight, but I have a pretty good reason, which is I'm about to go in this building and vote for the most important climate change legislation in history. The Inflation Reduction Act, which is passing the House today and on its way to the President, we're told will reduce our carbon emissions by 40% below 2005 levels in just the next 8 years. That's huge. And of course, I'm so proud to have worked with all of you on so many issues of importance in the Hudson Valley. The Hudson Valley Conservation Act, saving thousands of acres from development. How about cleaning up the Hudson River of PCBs? We led the fight on that. And of course, more recently, keeping oil barge anchorages off the Hudson River forever. Look, we know there's more work to do. Cleaning up PFAS contamination in drinking water, making sure we continue to fight climate change with all the tools we have. But look, I just want to say thank you for the work you do and for your leadership, and for all the support you've given me. And I hope we're celebrating today because it's a good day for the environment. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm sorry to say that's the extent of the position and answers that we have from the congressman. So Senator Biaggi, I will try to, we have a bunch of questions, and since there is only one of you here tonight, I will go through maybe all of them, and I will just, pipe up when it's time, like when you should wrap up so that we can get to the next question. So the questions that I'm going to ask tonight represent a compilation of the detailed, specialized concerns of multiple environmental groups. There's no expectation that any single candidate would be well equipped to address each bullet point without doing research. However, we're interested in discovering which issues you consider them to be the most pressing and how you would address them. So I'd like to start with fossil fuels and support or lack of support for those. So, and I think you've already touched on this, so it should be a quick one. Have you pledged to refuse campaign contributions from fossil fuel companies?
Yes.
All right, next. What is your legislative solution to the recent Supreme Court decision to change the powers of the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA?
So thank you for this question, and please tell me if I go on too long, but I'm going to try to be as succinct as possible so we can get through everything. I apologize that my opening was as long as it was. Okay, so first and foremost, I think that the context of this is that the Supreme Court is making decisions because in the ways that they are and ruling the way that they are because they are a radicalized Supreme Court. And so if we start from that premise, it is easy then to follow from that one of the things we have to do to address and to deal with legislatively the Supreme Court decision with regard to changing the powers of the EPA is to have Supreme Court justice reform. Those are things that include different policies I support. Term limits for every Supreme Court justice just from the bat, expanding the Supreme Court, which is important because if we expand it from 9 to 13, not only will it allow us to change the dynamic makeup, but it will also potentially open the opportunity for us to change the way that they rule on different cases that perhaps follows how appellate courts decide on things, which is a randomized selection of justices to make decisions that can only then go to the regular larger panel if it is necessary to do so. In that way, I think that even though those are just two examples of other things, that there are other things that I would do, but in that way, that's how we can start to, I think, undo some of the damage that the Supreme Court has done, and also that we can anticipate that it will do. And so I just want to start there because I think that's a place where it highlights some of my priorities. Accountability, oversight, and reform are some of the things I care the most about. And in this instance, it's no exception to that rule. And so I think at the end of the day, we can all at least look at this decision and see that the Supreme Court ruling goes far beyond just the serious problems that it caused for the EPA. It really does cut to the core ability of any federal agency to actually regulate, which is utterly terrifying. And frankly, I think going to send chills into how we are able to even function as a society. And so it really is essential to find ways to overcome the ruling in the immediate while we fight to take back the court. The court also said that agencies can't go beyond what Congress specifies. So Congress has to pass more detailed legislation and cut back on some of the delegation it left to agencies. The last thing I'll just say about New York implications, if that's all right, is that what I have learned just from my colleagues in the state Senate, as well as from counsel's office in the state Senate, is that the decision has minor, if any, ramifications or implications for New York's efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so any earlier concerns that the case that was decided was going to reverse its prior ruling that the EPA has authority to regulate CO2 under the CAA or to eliminate the general rule, I believe has been proven to be unfounded. So that's a positive thing. I also will just lastly say that although the court's ruling may really make it difficult for the EPA's efforts to establish a really broad-based set of regulations to curb CO2 emissions, it really is unclear just how far impacting that will be. And so I think we still have more to learn, but more importantly, I think that this is Congress's opportunity to be able to start taking a large crack at this. And my understanding, and I could be wrong, is that the bill that passed today is not part of the solution to that, but I'm happy to be proven wrong because I have only read through a very large summary one time, and it's going to take me probably several times to understand the entire implication of the bill that was passed today.
Okay, thank you. Do you believe the federal employees' retirement system should divest from fossil fuels? And if so, what would you do as a member of Congress to make that happen?
The answer is yes, and I would go even further and say that I think that all public pension funds, because we have the power to do this, whether it's at the state level, whether it's at the city council level, whether it's at a municipal level, should be doing this if we are serious about our commitment to fighting climate change. It's a very important action to take because it signals that we actually are not just committed to talking about climate justice or climate change. We're not just saying that we're going to do something about it or drawing up a piece of legislation, but we're actually taking our money out of the industry. And I think one of the ways that we can really not just cripple the industry, but stop our reliance on it is by stopping our investment of it. And so, I mean, there are ways to pass legislation to do that. I know in New York State, the comptroller on their own accord, just the office decided that they were going to begin to divest, I believe, from fossil fuels. And so one of the things I would do is probably begin to organize other colleagues around wanting to do that and be able to just number one, organize, write a letter, be able to deliver that letter to see what the response is, and then where necessary, because it is frankly always necessary, start to get the communities that I represent, that my colleagues represent involved, to be able to put public pressure on the institutions that are overseeing the pension fund. And so unfortunately, I wish it didn't have to be so difficult every time to do what seems so obviously like the right thing to do, but it does take a tremendous amount of energy and momentum. And just to like underscore that, I don't think that the bill that passed in Congress today would have ever happened without any of the organizing and the tremendous amount of effort that has gone on over several decades. And I think that's important to note, because even though it looks easy, or it may seem like, oh, well, they just passed this bill and, you know, the members of Congress voted yes for it, I think more and most of the work has come from outside of the legislature.
Okay, thank you. Next question. What are the renewable energy industries and incentives you support? And just to like be clear, I think what this question is getting at is, what do you consider renewable energy? Nuclear, green hydrogen, clean coal, natural gas? Like what are the renewable energy industries and incentives that you support?
Sure. So first and foremost, I have had the privilege and the benefit of meeting with many different organizations, climate justice and environmental organizations in CD17, but also throughout New York State as well, who have been really helpful for me in understanding how to even assess or address or understand what the renewable sources are and also what they are not. And so just from the top, one of the most important things that I think that we can do is to invest in things like, when New York is already starting to do this, but in hydro, in water, in solar, which again, New York has done some of these things already. We're starting to do even more of them. And this year's budget in New York started to do it. And I also know that there are investments in the bill that passed today that will continue that. Things like EV stations, things like converting large buildings to electric heat, and also any new buildings that are going to be built, preventing them from having new fossil fuel hookups. Things of that nature to me are important, because again, it starts to wean our reliance on fossil fuels away. I will say that when it comes to modern nuclear and my understanding of it, it is evolving over time. And I originally had that as part of my list of renewable resources. My growing understanding of it is that I know less than I know more about it. And so I am in a continuing to learn more information stage, which I think is really the case for so much around renewable resources. But that is really a great part, and thanks to so many of you and so many of the people that I've spoken with over the past few months who have had a really in-depth amount of information surrounding modern nuclear and the myths that surround it, and the kinds of stories that the industry tries to tell the public to be able to at least try to trust them, even when what they're saying is actually untrustworthy. And so the last thing I'll just say is that part of the renewable energy categories that I think is important, that I would be remiss to not include, is geothermal. Now, I will just also say to those of you who are thinking to themselves like, but also isn't geothermal not renewable? I engaged in a conversation with someone in CD17 who was a scientist who was arguing with me that it's not renewable. And so I have read different opinions about this. My conclusion is that it is renewable, but I am open to being persuaded out of the fact that geothermal is renewable. But again, this is something that I'm learning more about every single day. And why this matters is because as we're aggressively trying to reverse climate change, we also need to be adapting. And part of adaptation is exactly what you mentioned, which is these different renewable resources.
Great, thank you. So to change gears a little bit, we're going to do a lightning round. So this one doesn't even necessarily require you to speak. You can just give us a thumbs up if you support and a thumbs down if you do not. So do you support the Green New Deal for public housing? Yes. Do you support the Green New Deal for public schools? Do you support the permitting of any new U.S. drilling and mining leases? That comes down. Do you support crypto mining? And I think you already touched on that, which is that you do not. And then the other one is, would you sign the FERC to FREC pledge? So for folks who don't know, FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So that's the commission that got us the Algonquin pipeline under Indian Point Nuclear Power Plant, because they rubber stamp every gas pipeline project that comes before them. And grassroots organizations Beyond Extreme Energy came up with the Federal Renewable Energy Commission and a plan to convert that. And I know Elizabeth Warren, for instance, was in support. So in Congress, would you support converting FERC to FREC?
So can I actually comment on this, because I have a
Sure.
question about it. I just only came to through my research. Okay, so on its face, yes, like I understand what the current commission is doing and who's funding it. And I think the biggest problem that I have with just the current structure of the Energy Commission is the fact that its entire entity is being funded based not on the public's safety, but on what's best for the industry. And so being able to fund it through things like a carbon tax or a polluter's tax, to me seems like the exact thing that we should be doing. My one question about this is that through what I was reading, what I learned was that there is an office within, I believe, the energy, now I'm going to forget, but the name of the office is the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. And so you don't, obviously this is a forum for me to answer questions, but what I'm trying to understand is what are the inadequacies of that office in relation to this pledge, and how does that even relate to the new commission on renewable energy, which I believe is important. We need to have renewable, not just experts, but we need to have renewable offices that are actually committed to making sure that our investments are actually moving us in that direction, as opposed to continuing to perpetuate new oil lines and new gas pipelines. And so I'm not asking you necessarily to answer that question, but I just want you to know that that's what came up when I was researching to understand more
So I
broadly.
believe that question was submitted by Marilyn Ellie of Indian Point Safe Energy Coalition. So I can have her follow up on that question that you have.
Please.
Great,
But
thank you.
just if tomorrow you were asking me like, would you vote for that? The answer would be yes. But I want to understand, like, how does that relate to what already exists in government, and how do we make sure that we're not like duplicating efforts? Because as supportive as I am of making sure that government is actually solving for a lot of these problems, because I believe in that, I believe that's one of the purposes of why government exists, is to actually keep people safe and to deliver and to serve people. I always also know that the more bureaucracy that's involved, the more difficult it can become to actually achieve the goal, because there might be duplications. So that's all. That's my only question.
Thank you. So switching gears again, I'd like to address Indian Point. So many of you know, we have a nuclear power plant within CD17. It was recently closed and is now in the process of being decommissioned. Indian Point is unique among all U.S. nuclear plants because it is the only plant in the nation sited on top of multiple high-pressure gas transmission pipelines. The plant is now currently being decommissioned with demolition ongoing less than 4,000 feet from Buchanan Verplanck Elementary School, my children's elementary school. So there are several questions on this topic that were submitted. The first I'd like to ask is, as our congressional representative from CD17, would you advocate for your own seat on the Indian Point Decommissioning Oversight Board? Right now, there is no federal member of that board.
The answer is yes. And just to be really clear about why my answer is yes, because if there is an issue that the community I represent cares about, and there is a gap in leadership or a void in leadership in being able to solve that problem, specifically in something like a board or in a hearing that's happening, or in any other kind of oversight ability or capacity as a legislator, I want to be able to be part of that and to be able to advocate for all of you and for all of us.
Thank you. So right now, Holtec is asking the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC, for several critical exemptions. For example, they want to be exempt from certain insurance requirements. How do you see your role in relation to the NRC's responsibilities and decision-making processes? And if you're able to follow along in the chat, there's been several comments about the federal agencies and these commissions and how they have failed CD17. So I think that's where that question likely came from.
Sure. So I think the most important way that I think any legislator, myself included, but especially a member of Congress, can participate in something like that is to have oversight and to be able to hold accountable agencies. I have a history of doing that in the New York State Senate. I am really keen on using the power of hearings to ask really challenging questions that get right to the heart of what the issue is or what the problem is when it comes to the people in charge of these agencies. And I would love to be able to do that as it relates to Holtec specifically, because one of the things that I have learned and understand is that Holtec is an organization and a company that, number one, has really started to cause a tremendous amount of harm, not just potentially in New York, but also in places like Massachusetts. And so when we understand that certain entities are either acting in bad faith or have solutions that they think are helpful to a community but are really harmful, for example, dumping radioactive activity into water as one example of how to deal with waste storage, I think it becomes really clear that when the regulatory agency overseeing perhaps any kind of company or organization that is tasked to do that is actually not doing its job, that the questions have to go then to the agency themselves and that they have to be put on notice, but more importantly, have to be made to answer questions to the public, because that is ultimately who they serve, even though sometimes often that is forgotten. And so when it comes specifically to Holtec, the procurement process, I think, was one of the worst processes as I have come to understand it, because they were selected from what seems to be a political decision, which again is never the right way to make any kind of decision. But more importantly, as it relates to a nuclear power plant, it is not only dangerous, it is so irresponsible. And so it means that we have to have even more oversight, because we understand that not only is this a company, an organization that has a history of acting in bad faith, but that their initial qualifications to even do this work were subpar. And so I would say oversight, I would say hearings, I would say public calling out of it. But I think the hearings are one of the most important places to do this kind of work.
Thank you. So another question was about the water dumping, or as Holtec insists on calling it, discharging. But you've kind of already touched on that. And I think, let's see. So I'd like to ask instead a question about the waste. So what is your position on a federal proposal to eventually transport the highly radioactive spent fuel rods to New Mexico on Navajo tribal lands?
The answer is no, not to do that. I think, first of all, the fact that we are even thinking about doing that, knowing the history of Indigenous peoples in this country, is so outrageous and so egregious. And I feel like it is negligent in a way that is outrageous. I also know that I think it's 2 states, New Mexico, and I'm forgetting that I think it's Texas, are currently in litigation over this. And so not only is it wrong for us to even propose to do that, but I'm glad to see that there is litigation, because it means that they're also concerned about the discharge of radioactive waste into their lands, and also especially into Indigenous lands, again, where we know that the history of the people who've lived there and also of just the way in which the land has been abused is something that we are trying to course correct and not try to add to. And so I would say, first and foremost, that I would be against doing that. I think that's important for all of you to know. My understanding about storing the waste is that the safest way, and again, I'm learning this, so I'm open to any kind of feedback, but that the safest way is to store it on site. I will just share with you that I've read a lot about how Holtec and other companies have said, well, you can just dump it into the water and then over time it can become humidified and all of the things that they say to make people feel safe. Not being a scientist, not being an expert, I have a really hard time imagining what it would be like to have radioactive waste put into our water supply, places like the Hudson River, for example, or into, the Cape Cod Bay. I think that something doesn't add up for me in a way that, again, I might be coming from a place of ignorance because I don't know the full science around it, but that seems like the worst choice that any single person, leader, or organization could ever make.
Thank you. And then one brief question, and then we'll move on from Indian Point. Would you support shutting off and purging the gas in the Algonquin pipeline during decommissioning and demolition at Indian Point?
Absolutely, yes. And when I learned that it was the only nuclear power plant that was built over this pipeline, it really did shock the conscience for me in a way that made me feel angry. So the answer is absolutely yes.
Thank you. So I'd like to turn to a few other issues in the district. One of them is the Wheelabrator trash incinerator. So Wheelabrator in Peekskill burns most of Westchester County's trash and is the largest source of air pollution in Westchester County. So do you support the closure of the Wheelabrator trash incinerator?
Yes, I do. And I also, even beyond that, would support banning all plants of that kind. I think that we do need federal policies that support reducing that kind of waste stream and recycling and composting. And so I think it's really important that we're not just doing it in one area, but that we are passing laws and rules that will affect the entire country, because other places that have similar kinds of operations are obviously also similarly harmed. And so, yes, the answer is absolutely yes.
And what is your solution to move federal policy towards zero waste solutions, making incinerators unnecessary?
Well, I think that one of them could potentially be an alternative of a landfill. I think that more acutely and more specifically to Westchester County and to New York State, I think that when we understand the harm that these kinds of plants cause, more specifically perhaps to the communities that are surrounding it, but also to the communities that are even tangentially related to it. I think having the buy-in of the county government and the state government to do this is something that's important. And why I think that it's a good place to start is because if Westchester County had an effort to move all Westchester communities to zero waste, which is something that I know that is underway because of many of you, that is a signal to the state that perhaps there should be statewide legislation. And when a state like New York takes the cue from a place like Westchester, which has been ahead of the curve, thankfully, because of the county executive and the change of leadership, then when a state like New York passes legislation like that at the state level, because of, I think, the prominence and the significance of what New York represents on the national stage, it will set in motion other states and sister states, places like California and other similarly led democratic states or places where people care about these kinds of things, to also pass similar legislation. And when that happens, at least what I have seen in many different issues, not just about the ability to address climate justice or to change issues like the Wheelabrator incinerator, is that the federal government then usually is able to take even faster action. And so I think that those levels of progress have to happen. And I would be happy as not just a member of Congress, but as a legislator to be part of that really ground up approach to doing it. I think that there is so much to learn from building that way, because it really does solidify the position to not only stay in place, but also to make sure that the decisions that we're making are actually long-term to keep people safe.
Thank you. So to switch gears again and go to fracked gas power plants, do you support the Dan Scammer appeal to the DEC over denial of their air permit. And for everybody assembled, Danskammer is a plant that they're hoping to repower up outside of Newburgh, New York, to switch it from coal to natural gas. And the Department of Environmental Conservation denied their air permits to pollute, and Danskammer is now appealing that. But to be clear, the air permit, while a state agency was involved in issuing or denying it, that is the federal EPA law. So it is a federal question, even if it's delegated to the state. So do you support Danskammer's appeal to the DEC over the denial of their air permit?
No, I'm totally opposed to this effort. Number one, I'm totally opposed to the effort to build a power plant burning fracked oil or any other fossil fuels, just full stop. That is one of the most important things I think that any person who says that they're a champion of climate justice can take a stand on. I think we need to be building power plants that use renewable energy, which is, I think, very abundantly clear to many people. But the last thing I want to say about this that I think is quite important here is that when I read the opinion that the judge issued on the first level of the case, what really struck me and made me feel not only relieved, but really proud, but then also equal parts terrified was this. Part of why the permit was denied is because the judge said that the provisions of the CLCPA could not be abided by, and that if the judge were to allow the air permit to go into effect, that it would basically render the CLCPA toothless. And so it made me really proud because that's exactly what we want to see, that the bill that we passed that we know was intended to do things like this is actually working. But it also made me, frankly, kind of angry because I am in a campaign currently with someone who behind the scenes was really trying to not only allow for this to happen, but like supporting the Danskammer power plant to actually be allowed to do this. And so it makes, again, I think it just shows how important it is to, yes, have state laws that are as strong as they possibly can be. And I'm proud to be part of a legislature that did that. But there's always that risk of individuals who are really threatening the progress. And I think that having individuals in these seats who are truly committed to making sure that we are focused on using renewable energy, investing in renewable energy is important, because if the CLCPA wasn't in place and the legislature didn't pass that, and that was supported behind the scenes from any members of Congress, but specifically the person that I am running against, I think that that could have had not only detrimental effects, but fatal effects. And it would have set us back tremendously. So I want to just end on that note, because I do think it's a point of clarity that is a distinguishing factor between myself and my opponent.
Thank you. Now to move to transportation. Do you support the high-speed rail project for Rockland County that our current Congress member Mondaire Jones was advocating for?
Absolutely. Yes, it is not only important, but it would be something that I would love to take the baton on and run with. Not just because it's important for Rockland County also to be able to have this kind of transportation infrastructure, but also because we know that when we invest in these kinds of things and things that are related to it, that it also helps us to fight the climate crisis. It is such an incredible, important use of our federal dollars, our state dollars, and it's a no-brainer for me.
Thank you. What are your ideas to incentivize electric vehicles and to electrify public transportation?
So some of them start with what we've already done at the state level. So in order to be able to do this, we know that it costs money. I know that any shift or any investment or any progress that we want to make in any kind of industry where government is going to regulate it can always be made better or be helped by an investment from government. And so at the state level, in our state budget, we have passed in our budget this past year investments in more EV stations, in the ability to, I believe, also reshore some of that manufacturing into New York for things like hydro and wind, et cetera. But I think one of the keys to expanding the use of electric vehicles is like reducing the cost of the vehicles and making it easier to charge them. And so the federal government can also help in their funding streams as well, subsidizing different charging stations and also really providing tax incentives to any individuals who want to purchase them. And then as production increases, I think that that will hopefully allow for costs also to decline. And that ultimately then can reduce or even eliminate the need for tax incentives overall, which I think is ultimately always the goal. But we want to make this so accessible that every single person can actually be able to have it. And I think that the federal government can also and should also provide subsidies for public transit and transportation and school systems to be able to convert all of their buses to electric buses and vehicles. I know that I know there's been certain county-wide efforts to do that. I also know that garbage trucks play a small yet impactful role in this. And to go even more local, I know that the banning of leaf blowers that are run by gas is, I know it's a localized issue simply because we don't have statewide legislation yet, but the statewide legislation that exists, I fully support. I believe I'm a co-sponsor on that bill, and I would even take that to the federal level and really just make it clear to people in not just CD17, but across the state and through a public campaign, just the significant amount of harm that is caused by these kinds of things. And then just lastly, I would say that one of the other investments that I think the federal government can do and should do is to encourage more housing development near transit hubs, so transit-oriented housing, so that we can also reduce the need for private vehicles.
And then I saw this question we didn't provide you in advance, and sorry to spring it on you, but Rob Fleischer in the chat earlier mentioned something that I do think we should have asked about, which is how do we address private aviation? So like we just all heard about Taylor Swift having more CO2 emissions than like certain entire countries with her private jet. But from Rob's comment, 3 of the largest entities that support private aviation at the White Plains Airport are all looking to massively increase their operations. And we know that's a big source. So I'm wondering, have you given thought to how to address private aviation and its impacts on not only in terms of climate and emissions, but like quality of life here in Westchester?
Totally. So just on the issue of Westchester County Airport, I know and I support fully just like the public stand that George Latimer, the county executive, is taking, and why I do and why I care about that and why to me what he's doing is important, but it's not totally sufficient, is because it shows that there is a will in the leaders that represent Westchester County, that they understand the significance of increasing the number of planes or the number of private planes specifically that are allowed to land in Westchester Airport and take off there every single day, because it directly impacts the people who live in Westchester County and does contribute to I think what is considered to be and is the impact on their health. And so that from an overall standpoint to me is a great place to start. But because the aviation industry is regulated by the federal government, I do think this is a place where a member of Congress can play a very strong role. And so appealing to the FAA as one way of dealing with Westchester Airport and really trying to limit its usage because it is so close to residential areas, to me is one of the things that I think we can do. I would also want to do research on what are the powers of Congress when it comes to some of these smaller airports and also even bigger airports, but specifically because this is a smaller one, what's the precedent here? What can a member of Congress do? Is there and are there gaps in the federal aviation law that could actually be served by passing legislation that could actually address this? I have met a few voters in CD17 who are pilots, and I've had a few conversations with them, and I would love to have more and even I know that there is already a public coalition of people who come together, but I, for my own sake, would love to have one in CD17. And then just beyond that, what I would say is, now I'm forgetting the last question. The first part of the question that you mentioned was,
it was just like how to address the expansion of private aviation.
Oh yes. Okay, sorry. Thank you for that. So I think a pollution tax, a carbon tax, is something that can really contribute to this. I read something similarly to what to what Taylor Swift is doing with regard to, I think it was Kylie or Kendall Jenner, that they took like a 6-minute flight from one part of LA to the other part. I, number one, think that if we make it, even though these are individuals who can pay these kinds of fees and essentially could become the cost of doing business, I think that if we make the cost of those kinds of short flights through regulation, tax at higher rates. It's like cigarettes, like the higher you tax them with the hope that you will have less people using them. It's the same kind of thing here. I think we can apply that kind of methodology and model. And I do think that this is a place where federal legislation can be implemented, because to take a 6-minute flight is, it's not just egregious. It is so absolutely thoughtless about every other person that is in community or in the state with where you live. And so I do think that there's a way to do this by time, by pollution tax, and then really looking at other industries that have really tamped down harmful products or harmful activity through very creative solutions, like how the cigarette industry has been taxed by the government.
Thank you very much. So that is the end of my list of questions, and we are approaching 8 o'clock as well. So in closing, why should environmental voters in CD17 cast their vote for you?
Well, first and foremost, I want to say just thank you very much again. And I cannot really tell you how much I appreciate just the opportunities to have a forum like this, just to be able to share some of my thoughts, but also to really highlight places where I know that I have so much more to learn, because I always will and always do. And I really hope to learn those things together, just like I've done at the state Senate level. And so when you are thinking about who to vote for tomorrow, when early voting begins on August 13th or on August 23rd, I think the most important thing that you should know, all of you should know about me, is that my values are democratic. What I'm rooted in are based in being able to fight for working people, but my loyalty will always be to the people that I represent. That is where I draw my power from. That is what I care the most about. And one of the ways that I'm able to uphold that value is by making sure that my commitments are public to all of you. One of the commitments I mentioned earlier was that I do not take corporate PAC money. I'm the only candidate in this race that doesn't. And why that matters is because we have seen the tremendous influence of money in politics. It has prevented us from making progress on so many topics, not just climate, but especially climate, healthcare, and housing, and a lot of different things that we all very much wake up in the morning fighting to actually achieve. And so it is no surprise to me that because of those things, and because of how strong I have been outspoken on making sure that we're housing people, that we have clean air and clean water, that we are championing issues for working people, that the individuals who are investing large amounts of dark super PAC money are individuals that we have in the state of New York, I think made a tremendous amount of progress against the power of. And so what you can count on from me, if elected to Congress, is that I will be a tireless champion, not just on my own, but with all of you. And that, again, is something that I am excited about. I look forward to it. I understand how difficult it is to get things done at the federal level. And I know that it's also made more possible when you're in community with the people that you represent. And at the end of the day, that will also allow me to be as independent and reform-minded as I think is necessary to really change the institution of Congress.
Thanks very much. And I did want to invite, we were planning to have both candidates here, a member from your campaigns to drop contact info into the chat for voters who want to get involved with your campaigns. Marie, maybe you can drop in the contact info for the Maloney campaign. So if folks want to reach out with questions that didn't get addressed, people could do that. I do want to thank you, Senator Biaggi, for joining us tonight, and thank everybody for coming out and for the engaging chat. I saw a lot of good questions, like Rob's question about the private aviation. We have a lot of organizations doing a lot of great work, and I am very thankful because I am not knowledgeable on every single one. So I was saying to Rob that it's great to have all of our different organizations all focusing on these different issues, coming together to make sure that these topics are campaign issues in this race. And with that, I would like to thank everybody for attending and for making this a great forum, and look forward to, remember, early voting starts tomorrow. So do get out and vote because it is an odd time for a primary to be happening, but it is a critical primary, and we all need to get out there and make sure we vote. So thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Alessandra Biaggi, for attending and putting a lot of research into all of these questions. It's very much appreciated.